Alexander Vindman is a retired US Army Lieutenant Colonel. Most recently, he was the Director for European Affairs in the National Security Council. He was born in Kyiv and his family moved to the United States when he was a child. Mr. Vindman, great to have you on DW News today. So, the US election, as we know, is just days away now at this stage. What would a Donald Trump win mean for Ukraine?
Well, thanks for having me on. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. It's been about a year since I've been to Germany. I've been thinking about this question of foreign policy and national security extensively. I just had an article come out in Newsweek today, basically talking about the effects of this election, both domestically and around the world. The impacts for Europe in particular are more immediate and dire. What you have in a Trump election is basically a turn to isolationism, something that we haven't had as a current in U.S. National security in many decades since before World War II. And in that kind of scenario, it creates a vacuum for the enemies of democracy. In your neck of the woods, that means Russia. It believes it has a freer hand. It believes it could escalate its hybrid warfare, its sabotage operations, its efforts to sow discord amongst the populations of Europe and within Germany, and potentially move towards a military aggression, which is a particularly dangerous situation for the Eastern European nations that fully believe they're next in Russia's crosshairs as soon as Russia is done rebuilding core elements of its empire. So it's quite a dangerous turn towards a larger war, a spillover, and a potential larger confrontation in Europe, the outlines of which we see today with foreign troops already kind of settling into support Russia, whether that's Iranian advisors and operators of drones, or the North Koreans starting with ammunition and now moving on to true presence.
It's pretty terrifying what you just had to say there. So, from the European perspective, what would you say should be done then?
Well, I think when I talk to the Europeans, I really do point out that they should be hedging against a worst-case scenario for Europe, for the world, which is a Donald Trump administration. In that kind of scenario, Europe is going to have to play a much more, frankly, more muscular role to deter Russian aggression. Russia is going to believe it has opportunities with the absence of the U.S., without the arsenal of democracy as a backbone to NATO. In that kind of scenario, we're going to have to see some sort of muscularity that we actually haven't seen in Europe, in Germany in too long. That sounds almost hawkish, but you have to think about it in the context of the Russians with their belief in opportunity and weakness. So Europe is going to have to make it clear that it will absolutely defend its national security interests. The way it starts to do that is by doubling down on support to Ukraine. Potentially that goes as far as what Emmanuel Macron has mentioned, with troop presence in support of Ukraine. That could be the Poles, the Romanians, the Baltic states that feel this danger more acutely, stepping up support and potentially putting in troops, again, on the premise of fighting Russia on Ukrainian territory is better than fighting on the home territory of European nations, of NATO nations. But I will say that I have faith and confidence in the American people. Yes, this election will be close, but we faced down despotism before, both in a foreign and domestic context in the U.S. And I could see the energy rallying around Kamala Harris. And in that case, it's more of an opportunity for the democracies to consolidate, to work together against this surging battle between the autocrats and the Democrats. It's a much more hopeful view, grounded in reality, that we will likely face, but a lot of work to do.
Right.
The dangers don't disappear. We'll just have an opportunity to work together instead of working individually.
But Alexander, of course, we have to take into account that there is this possibility that Donald Trump could win, of course, and he says that it's in the interest of the American people to stop funding a war that's far away. So how would you argue to him that it's best to actually continue supporting Ukraine?
So honestly, this is a misconception, is that you could somehow negotiate or make a deal with Donald Trump. That's just not likely true. The fact is that Trump will be a friend to our mutual enemies, our adversaries, the folks that threaten our way of life, and a threat to democracies, to Germany, to France, to all European democracies. I think it is a fool's errand to try to see if look, it's worth it. Don't get me wrong. It's absolutely worth it to try to make those overtures, to reach out, communicate. Maybe there's a deal to be done, something very transactional where Europe really takes on a much, much heavier burden that may entice Donald Trump to not withdraw from NATO, but that's not likely. The program for Donald Trump, for J.D. Vance, this very dangerous program called Project 2025 will see us withdraw from our role as a central member of the NATO alliance, and frankly, as a bulwark for democracy around the world. So yes, it's worth trying, but I think the Europeans should, in the eventuality of a Trump administration, should really understand how precarious the situation is and think about the idea that Europe will have to go it alone more than relying on the US. It's terrifying, but it's true.
Yeah, terrifying is the word. And of course, we're talking as well about essentially a monumental shift in many ways. Let's talk about Kamala Harris. Would you see much of a change in her policies towards Ukraine, or would it essentially be a continuation of what we've seen under Biden?
So the baseline would be some sort of continuity, a status quo of sorts. But I actually think it's probably going to end up being better than that. The reason is that it's neither in the U.S. or European, or certainly not in the Ukrainian interest for a perpetual war between Russia and Ukraine. And there is an opportunity in the third year, deep into the third year of war, where Russia, under a Harris administration, recognizes it faces the full might of Ukraine, backed by democracies, backed by NATO, Europe, and the U.S., and really needs a push to move towards negotiations. And what that push amounts to is Ukrainian successes on the battlefield. So in addition to having those geopolitical tailwinds for Ukraine with support, ironclad support for Ukraine for the foreseeable future, providing Ukraine with additional resources, military resources, ammunition, training, which is absolutely essential, the industrial base, investing in Ukraine's industrial base, and the preparation for the Ukrainians to be successful on the battlefield could really set the conditions for Ukraine to press Russia into negotiations.
Alexander, we've got about 40 seconds left, but I do want to ask you this. As someone who's born in Ukraine, how do you see Ukrainians in their commitment?
Well, so I think the Ukrainians as a people aspire to Europe. That's why they had a revolution of dignity and paid this very, very dear price. I think Europe should welcome Ukraine because Ukraine will add to Europe's strength. I think that's a mutually beneficial relationship. The hesitancy on the part of the German leadership needs to shift, and Germany needs to play a much more powerful role in European security in support of Ukraine and in pushing back against authoritarianism and autocrats that are surging around the world.
Alexander, it's been certainly interesting and very sobering speaking to you this evening. US Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, thanks for joining us on DW News.
Thank you.
Well, we can talk now with Nora Bensahel, an expert on warfare and US defence policy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Good to have you on DW News. So we just heard in that report that Ukraine wants the US to increase pressure on Russia, for example, by freezing Russian assets. Do you see that happening under either Harris or Trump?
I think the policy differences between a Harris and Trump administration would be considerable on Ukraine. I'm very skeptical that Trump, if he were to be elected, would change his policies towards Ukraine. He has spoken directly about wanting to stop that war, he claims, in 24 hours. I don't think it could be that quickly, but it would essentially freeze in place the borders and the territory that is held today, which would no doubt be a strategic loss for Ukraine. The issue of freezing resources, Russian resources, and helping that get back to Ukraine in terms of assistance, I think, is probably not what's most likely. I think if there were to be increased assistance to Ukraine, and I think that depends very heavily on the results of the congressional elections, not just the presidential elections, most of that money is being spent in the United States on armaments that are being provided to Ukraine. So I think it would continue to be U.S. money that is essentially being spent domestically in order to help Ukraine.
And what about when we're talking about weapons, long-range weapons? Ukraine says it urgently needs more from the US.
Ukraine has said that since the beginning of the war, and there has been a tension because the Biden administration has wanted to ensure that any assistance to Ukraine does not provoke Russia into escalation, into some direct conflict with the United States or NATO, and potentially, as Putin warned early in the war, a nuclear confrontation. I think that a Harris administration would have many of the same concerns about deterrence and the Russian role. And again, Trump's policies, and he, there's a lot of evidence that his people are planning to implement the policies that they are talking about on the campaign, as any incoming administration would. They want to end the war. So I don't see how that would end up releasing some of those restrictions. In that sense, the Ukrainians have to be hoping for a Harris win rather than a Trump win.
Now, the longer the war in Ukraine goes on, the bigger an issue it becomes essentially in the United States, where it's already been discussed at length, obviously, considering we're in this presidential campaign. And you mentioned it as well. We're also talking about it's not just the president, it's also what happens in Congress. So do you see patience or support running out? Is that a serious concern for you?
The Republicans in Congress have been leading the campaign to reduce aid and assistance to Ukraine, have tried to stop it several times in this congressional session. So the control of Congress matters greatly to this discussion. And right now, it's too close to tell. If the Republicans maintain control of at least one of the chambers of Congress, either the House or the Senate, then they will have leverage to try to impose their views and reduce that assistance. But again, if Trump is elected president, there may not be a request to Congress for that kind of assistance anyway. I think in that case, in a Harris administration, if the Republicans control at least one of the two chambers, they will try to block continued assistance. But it's possible that the Democrats can cut a deal to get it through the same way they have over the previous 4 years.
Well, we'll be keeping a very, very close eye on this, of course, in the next few weeks and months. Thanks so much, Nora. Nora Bensahel joining us today from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies.